You're still watching the Morning Call here on Africanews. Now, 2020 will be a decisive year for Ethiopia rather. The Horn of Africa country will hold elections under a changed yet tense political environment in May. Since assuming office in April 2018, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has taken bold steps to open up the country's politics, releasing political opponents, activists, and lifting the lid on political parties. But huge challenges remain, which have got many Horn of Africa watchers concerned about Ethiopia's transition to democracy, Ruth.
Indeed, Nyasha, if the Ethiopian Prime Minister insists on holding these elections, intercommunal violence and growing resentment among the political elite could force him to back down and postpone the legislative elections scheduled for May. Although some reforms undertaken have earned him the Nobel Peace Prize, the fact remains that his openness has also opened the door to internal challenges. Yet, according to analysts, any postponement of the election would be controversial since the Ethiopian constitution makes no provision for such a scenario. And to discuss this further, we are joined by William Davison, a senior analyst at Crisis Group. Hello, William, and thanks for your time. How would you describe what's happening in Ethiopia at the moment?
Pouvez-vous nous décrire la situation actuelle en Éthiopie alors que, on l'a dit, le pays s'achemine vers ses premières élections législatives depuis près de 20 ans?
Well, things have been quite unstable over the past 18 months or so since the Prime Minister took office. They were obviously unstable before that with 3 years of government protests. It's probably worth mentioning there haven't been any major outbreaks of the type of ethnic, intercommunal violence that we've seen. We haven't seen that in the past couple of months. But there's still quite a lot of political volatility with the creation of the new ruling party from the ashes of the EPRDF coalition. That's led to one of the major regions, Tigray, staying out of this new ruling party. And there's also been some high-level dissent from the Prime Minister's own party. So although things are, thankfully, have been less violent recently, there is still quite a lot of political volatility as we move towards the campaigning period for elections that are scheduled for May.
Now, Mr. Davison, how must the Prime Minister navigate these challenges that you've just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing now is election preparation. Any ideas that the election would be significantly postponed, or even there was some suggestion that Ethiopia should move into a formal sort of transitional government period. All of those ideas now don't seem to be on the table. And instead, we are rapidly approaching elections. So I think the best that could be hoped for is that all of the normal, regular sort of institutional procedures to hold competitive elections are accelerated. The work that the electoral board is doing, but also in terms of negotiations between parties, whether with the government or between the different competing factions, to ensure that the election and the government institutions carrying out the election have as much legitimacy, as much support and trust as possible from the various electoral actors.
Monsieur Davison, ces élections sont-elles...
Mr. Davison, how serious is a threat to ethno-religionist strife is these elections?
I mean, it certainly poses a considerable risk, but at the same time, it's perfectly possible to plot a non-disastrous and relatively peaceful way forward. But there certainly are challenges. If we look at something like the dispute between the Tigray and Amhara regions, that's a very entrenched dispute with historical resonance and kind of centers on some territorial claims on Tigrayan land from the Amhara. That's a very difficult issue to resolve, especially in the context of the election. And there's actually a danger that tensions increase on that issue due to the dynamics of the electoral campaign. So when we take a dispute like that, it's worrying And what needs to happen is that both sides need to realize that there is no immediate resolution to this problem, that the focus must be on a peaceful election, and then negotiations can ensue after the election on these very tricky matters. It's just an example of how the difficult issues that risk violence need to be solved. We could also look at the situation in southern Ethiopia, where there's these autonomy demands for the creation of new regional states from various groups down there. These are, again, it's a difficult political issue for the authorities to solve. And really the energy and the attention needs to be focused on everybody on holding elections.
Now, what kind of support does the country need to make sure that the transition doesn't unravel?
The civil society and the media's ability to scrutinize and report and monitor this election and any potential abuses contained with it is still quite weak. So civil society and media could do with as much assistance as possible. There's also this huge issue of Ethiopia's economic situation. It's been a relatively fast-growing country, but has run into some debt problems, and now there's quite a marked shift to a more economically liberal model. There's already plenty of assistance from the World Bank and the IMF and other entities for that process. That sort of economic assistance is much needed, but also this type of fairly radical economic reform also has political ramifications. There is opposition to it, and it also runs the risks of there being some negative consequences in terms of economic shocks at a time of great political volatility. So when the international community is providing assistance to these economic reform, economic modernization programs, they need to be careful that they are doing that in a politically sensitive fashion, and that they are mitigating for any potentially harmful effects of those economic reforms.